On August 17, 1945, 2 days after Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender, a group of Japanese soldiers emerged from caves on the island of Okinawa. They had held out for weeks after organized resistance had collapsed, expecting death, preparing for death, accepting death as preferable to the dishonor of surrender. But starvation and wounds had finally made their position untenable, and now they walked slowly toward American lines, hands raised, waiting for the bullets that would end their shame. The bullets never came. American soldiers approached cautiously, disarmed them, gave them water and medical attention, and transported them to a processing center. The Japanese soldiers said nothing, met no one's eyes, carried themselves with the rigid bearing of men who were already dead in every way that mattered. They had been taught from childhood that capture meant dishonor worse than death, that no Japanese soldier could face his family, his emperor, his ancestors after the shame of surrender. They had been told that American treatment of prisoners would be barbaric, that torture and execution awaited them, and they had accepted this as the just consequence of their failure. What they could not have imagined, what their training and culture had left them completely unprepared for, was that within 6 months they would be standing in line at an American camp, signing documents and receiving actual money as payment for their labor. It was an absurdity so complete, so alien to everything they understood about warfare and honor and duty, that many of them would struggle for years to integrate the experience into any coherent worldview. The American military's handling of Japanese prisoners of war was complicated by profound cultural differences that went far beyond language. In European culture, surrender when defeat was inevitable was considered pragmatic, even honorable if conducted properly. A German or Italian soldier who surrendered when further resistance was pointless had done his duty and could return home after the war with honor intact. But in Japanese military culture, surrender was unthinkable, literally unthinkable, so foreign to the warrior code that the military had made almost no provision for it. Japanese soldiers were taught that death was preferable to capture in every circumstance, that to survive as a prisoner was to betray everything they held sacred. This was not metaphor or exaggeration. It was literal doctrine, reinforced through years of training, embedded in every aspect of military culture. The result was that Japanese soldiers fought to the death even in hopeless situations, and the few who were captured were often wounded, unconscious, or so debilitated that they physically could not continue fighting. They arrived in American custody not just as defeated soldiers, but as men who believed their lives were over, who expected nothing but death and welcomed it as the only way to end their unbearable shame. The American guards and camp administrators confronted prisoners who would not make eye contact, who refused to speak, who seemed to be waiting passively for execution. The first challenge was simply convincing them that they would not be killed. Medical personnel treating wounded Japanese prisoners found that some refused treatment, apparently hoping to die of their injuries. Others accepted treatment, but remained, withdrawn, speaking only when directly questioned, giving minimal responses. The psychological state of these men was unlike anything American personnel had encountered with German or Italian prisoners, who might be depressed or resentful, but who engaged with their captors, who wanted to survive and return home. Japanese prisoners seemed to have no such desire. They existed in a state of profound psychological shock, cut off from everything that had given their lives meaning, waiting for an end that did not come. American psychiatrists, brought in to assess the situation, struggled to find frameworks for understanding. These were not merely demoralized soldiers. They were men whose entire sense of identity had been shattered, who had violated the deepest principles of their culture and now existed in a kind of social death, even while physically alive. The decision. To pay Japanese prisoners wages for their labor was not based on psychological insight or cultural sensitivity. It was simply standard American policy, applied uniformly to all prisoners of war in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. German and Italian prisoners in American camps were paid for their work, and so Japanese prisoners would be paid as well. The policy made pragmatic sense. Paying prisoners created an incentive for cooperation and gave camp administrators a tool for managing behavior. Prisoners who worked earned canteen privileges. Those who refused to work or caused trouble could have their wages withheld. It was a simple, practical system based on American assumptions about human motivation. But those assumptions were rooted in a culture that valued individual economic achievement, that saw paid labor as dignified and normal, that connected personal effort to personal reward. Japanese military culture operated on completely different principles. Soldiers served without expectation of personal reward because service itself was the purpose. The idea of being paid for work, especially while a prisoner, especially by the enemy, had no place in their conceptual universe. When the first work details were organized and Japanese prisoners were told they would receive payment, many of them simply stared in incomprehension, unsure if they had misunderstood the translation. The work itself was similar to what German prisoners did. Agricultural labor, camp maintenance, food service, laundry, basic tasks that kept the camps functioning and supported the war effort indirectly by freeing American personnel for other duties. The Japanese prisoners approached this work with the same discipline and attention to detail they had brought to military service. They worked carefully, precisely, taking pride in the quality of their output, even in the smallest tasks. American supervisors quickly learned that Japanese work details required minimal oversight. If told to dig a ditch, they would dig it exactly as specified, perfectly straight, proper depth, with an attention to detail that exceeded what was actually necessary. This was not because they were trying to earn approval or avoid punishment. It was simply how they had been trained to approach any task, with complete focus and maximum effort. But this created an irony that they themselves seemed to recognize. They were working harder as prisoners for the Americans than many American workers would have worked for themselves. The discipline that was supposed to make them superior soldiers was now benefiting the enemy, and there was nothing they could do about it. To refuse to work properly would be to violate their own standards, something psychologically impossible even in their current state. So they worked with precision and care, and the Americans paid them, and the entire situation existed in a realm of surreal absurdity that no one seemed able to address directly. The first payment distribution at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin in early 1946 proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency. Japanese prisoners lined up, presented their identification, signed or made their mark on payroll documents, and received scrip representing their wages for the previous month's labor. The amounts were small by American standards, calculated at the rate specified by the Geneva Conventions, but they were real compensation for real work. The prisoners took their scrip and returned to their barracks in silence. That evening, the camp translator, a Nisei linguist from California, made his rounds and discovered that almost none of the prisoners had used their scrip at the canteen, even though they were permitted to do so. When he asked why, the responses were confused and contradictory. Some said they had no need for anything. Others said it seemed wrong to spend money earned while a prisoner. One older soldier, a veteran of campaigns in China and the Philippines, said simply, "We are dead men. Dead men do not need cigarettes or candy." The translator reported this to the camp commander, who listened carefully and then asked a question that cut to the heart of the cultural divide. Do they understand that the money is theirs, that they earned it, that it's not a trick or a loan? The translator nodded. They understand the mechanism, sir. What they don't understand is the concept. In their minds, a prisoner has no rights, no property, no existence as a person. The idea that they could earn money and spend it on personal items while imprisoned makes no sense to them. It's like telling a ghost he can buy a house. Over time, some of the younger prisoners, particularly those who had been conscripted late in the war and who had less ideological investment in the military code, began to use their scrip. The camp canteen carried items that were unavailable or strictly rationed in wartime Japan: chocolate, cigarettes, soap, writing paper, even small luxuries like combs and playing cards. The temptation of these goods, combined with the grinding tedium of camp life, gradually overcame cultural conditioning. But the act of purchasing remained psychologically complex. Prisoners would approach the canteen counter hesitantly, speak quietly, take their purchases quickly, and return to their barracks as if ashamed to be seen. There was no casual shopping, no browsing, none of the relaxed consumer behavior that American soldiers displayed at their own canteens. Every transaction carried a weight of significance, an acknowledgement that they were engaging in behavior that would have been unthinkable before their capture. And yet they did it, because they were young and imprisoned, and the alternatives were worse. One prisoner, interviewed decades later by Japanese researchers studying the POW experience, described his first canteen purchase. "I bought a chocolate bar. I had not tasted chocolate since before the war. I took it back to my bunk and ate it in small pieces over 3 days, and every bite was delicious and shameful in equal measure. I was alive when I should have been dead. I was enjoying an enemy luxury when my family was starving. I had become something I did not recognize. The older prisoners, the veterans, the hardcore believers in the military code watched this gradual adaptation with anger and contempt. To them, the younger prisoners who used their wages were collaborating, allowing themselves to be corrupted by American materialism, forgetting their duty and their honor. Tensions within the prisoner population grew sharp. There were incidents of intimidation, beatings in the barracks after dark, prisoners punished by their own comrades for accepting the terms of their captivity too readily. The American camp. Administrators, alerted by informants and by the translator's observations, moved to separate the hardliners from the rest of the population. The hardcore groups were consolidated in separate barracks, given their own work details, essentially allowed to maintain their ideological purity in isolation. The rest of the camp population, relieved of the pressure from the true believers, began to relax incrementally. They still worked with characteristic Japanese precision, but they also began to interact more normally with guards, to ask questions, to express curiosity about America. And they began to spend their wages more freely, to engage with the small, consumer economy of the camp, to experience what was, for many of them, a completely new relationship between labor and personal reward. The ideological implications of this wage system were not lost on the more thoughtful prisoners, particularly those who had experienced Japanese society before militarization and who could remember a time when different values had prevailed. Japan in the 1920s had been experimenting with democracy, with labor movements, with concepts of individual rights. All of that had been systematically crushed in the 1930s as the military gained control and remade society along totalitarian lines. But some of the older prisoners remembered, and they recognized that the American system of compensating labor was fundamentally connected to concepts of human dignity and individual worth that Japanese militarism had rejected. To be paid for. Your work was to be recognized as a person with agency, with rights, with the capacity to make choices about how to use the fruits of your labor. It was a small thing, camp script spent on chocolate and cigarettes, but it encoded an entire political philosophy. One prisoner, a former school teacher conscripted in 1944, began teaching informal English classes to other prisoners, and in his lessons, he emphasized not just vocabulary and grammar, but concepts. In America, he would explain, work is connected to payment, and payment is connected to choice, and choice is connected to freedom. We were taught that freedom was weakness, that collective purpose was strength. But look at who won the war. Perhaps we should reconsider what strength means. By late 1946, with the war over and repatriation beginning, the Japanese prisoners at American camps had accumulated collectively significant amounts of scrip. The question arose, what would happen to this money when they returned to Japan? The Geneva Conventions specified that prisoners' wages were their property, but converting camp scrip to currency that would be useful in occupied Japan was administratively complex. The American military solved the problem pragmatically. Prisoners being repatriated could convert their scrip to Japanese yen at official exchange rates, and the money would be provided as they boarded ships home. For many prisoners, this resulted in a sum that was significant by the standards of devastated post-war Japan, where inflation was rampant and most people had lost everything. A prisoner who had worked for a year and saved his wages might return home with enough money to start a small business or buy goods on the black market to support his family through the first difficult months of peace. The irony was profound and inescapable. Prisoners of war were returning to defeated Japan with more resources than many civilians who had never left. They had been paid by the enemy, had been fed and sheltered by the enemy, had been treated by the enemy with standards of care that their own government had failed to provide its citizens. How could they reconcile this with what they had been taught about American barbarity and Japanese superiority? The return to Japan was psychologically wrenching in ways that European prisoners did not experience. German and Italian soldiers returned home as defeated warriors, but they returned to societies that acknowledged them as soldiers who had done their duty. Japanese prisoners returned to a society that viewed them with contempt and suspicion. Families often refused to acknowledge them. Communities shunned them. Employers would not hire them. The stigma of surrender was so powerful that many former prisoners changed their names, moved to different cities, concealed their wartime experience entirely. They lived with shame and silence, unable to speak about what they had endured or what they had learned. But the money they brought back was real and useful, and it could not be easily dismissed. Some used it to restart their lives in new places where no one knew their history. Others quietly helped their families survive the desperate early years of the occupation, and a few, a small but significant number, used their resources and their experience to become advocates for a different kind of Japan, one that embraced some of the values they had encountered in American captivity. They had seen that workers could be compensated fairly, that individual effort could be rewarded, that systems based on consent rather than coercion could function effectively. These were dangerous ideas in a society struggling to rebuild its identity, but they took root slowly, contributing to the remarkable transformation of post-war Japan. One former prisoner, who became a labor organizer in the 1950s, wrote in his unpublished memoir about the strange education he received in an American POW camp. "I learned more about human dignity from being paid $5 a month by my captors than I learned in 4 years of military service to the emperor," he wrote. "The Americans treated us as if we were people, even though we were their enemies, even though we had killed their soldiers, even though we were supposed to be beneath their notice. They paid us because in their system, people who work deserve to be paid." It was such a simple principle, and it revealed how bankrupt our own system had become, how we had reduced human beings to expendable tools of the state. I returned to Japan with American dollars in my pocket and American ideas in my head, and both were subversive to everything I had been taught. But both were more valuable than all the ideology I had absorbed in my youth. The dollars I spent, the ideas remain with me still. His memoir was never published during his lifetime. too controversial for a society still grappling with its past. But it was preserved by his family and eventually donated to a research institute studying the war's impact on individual lives. It stands as testimony to the power of small gestures, of policies enacted not for their psychological impact, but simply because they reflected American values, of wages paid to enemy prisoners that became, unexpectedly, a tool for ideological transformation more effective than any propaganda campaign could have been. The Japanese prisoners, who couldn't believe they were being paid, learned slowly and painfully that their unbelief was rooted in assumptions about power and human worth, that the war had proven catastrophically wrong. And some of them, at least, carried that lesson forward into a future that neither they nor their captors could have predicted when they first stood in that pay line, signing for money they had never expected to receive, beginning an education they had never agreed to undertake, becoming, against all odds and intentions, agents of their own country's transformation.